Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to talk about books that I read in the month of April, part 2. So I already filmed a part 1 wrap-up of April because I read a ton of books last month, and I didn't want the fact that I read a lot of books to lessen the detail of my reviews, thus I have split the wrap-up into 2 parts. The first part is very divided. It's a bunch of books I hated and a bunch of books I loved, and I encourage you to go check it out because I think it's pretty cool, but I think most of the videos I post are pretty cool. But today I'm here to talk about the books that I read in the last week of April, which there are 8 of them. I participated in a readathon called 25 in 5, which was about trying to read 25 hours over 5 days. I wound up reading about 15 hours, and in that time I managed to finish 8 things, which is pretty great, and today I'm going to talk about them, starting from the book I liked least and working up to the book I liked most. Much like my first half of April, I have at least one book that I really hated and at least one book that I really loved, so good division, and let's just start at the bottom and work our way up. So at the bottom of our list, we have Scooby Apocalypse, Volume 1 by Keith Giffen, J.M. DeMatteis, and Howard Porter. I was really hopeful about this particular trade paperback because I love Scooby-Doo. I am beyond passionate about Scooby-Doo. It's been my favorite for many a year, and that will probably never change about me. This is basically AU fanfic, so it's not set in the universe of Scooby-Doo. None of the Scooby Gang have ever met each other before besides Daphne and Fred, but the Scooby Gang, not the Buffy Scooby Gang, all come together because Velma has invited Daphne, who has a television show, into a secret lab where Velma believes the end of the world is going to begin, and it winds up being true, and so the 4 humans and 1 dog have to team up to try to figure out how the world is ending, why it's ending, and how to fix it. So writing AU fanfic for, my favorite shows, that's a pretty solid pitch for me, because that's one of the things I enjoy, but it feels like maybe at least one woman should have been involved, ever, at any point in the creative process of this comic. But, not a single woman. Not a single woman on that creative team, and you can tell because everyone basically gets along and it's pretty much fine, except Velma and Daphne hate each other and say horrible things to each other for the entire runtime of the comic. And, this could be good, except for a couple of things that prevent it from being okay. One is the fact that they repeat themselves so often, it took me forever to get through this entire comic series. I have never read a more wordy comic series. There is constant dialogue, too much dialogue, and it is repetitive from beginning to end. If I had to hear one more time about how Daphne didn't trust Velma, I was gonna give up, because it wouldn't stop. Every other page was the same conversation. Also, I think the writers of this comic were trying to characterize Velma as autistic, which would have been interesting had they actually done that, but instead they just do the thing that, Big Bang Theory does, where Velma is weird and antisocial, and so then it's not even representation, it's just, scrounging for representation that's not done well at all. It's writing an actual autistic Velma could have been really awesome for representing a character from fiction, and no. And here's my thing. Here's my biggest thing. If you're going to write AU fanfic about characters from a television show, at the very least make the girls kiss. What's the point besides that, All this really had going for it was the art style. Which I did really like. I liked the art style. I really liked the character design. I thought that this was a cool looking group of people. And the monsters are pretty cool looking. There's a good page. And even, you can see them on the front. I think it's cool character design, but it was wordy, it was unnecessary, and I didn't like it. And I gave it 2 stars. Next we have an audiobook. Oh my god, I know, right? It was Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. This is an audiobook I listened to because I needed an audiobook during this 25 in 5 so that I could still be reading while I was getting other things done, and I can't listen to fiction via audio. My brain does not comprehend it, my brain does not take it in. So, I was looking for non-fiction audiobooks, and I wound up happening upon this one on Amazon for pretty cheap, and I mean, frankly, I did a pretty bad job of paying attention to this as well. I can't consume audio things. It just doesn't work. But this is a lot more serious than I think the title would lead you to believe. Like, I went into this book thinking Men Explain Things to Me was just going to be sort of a, a deep dive on mansplaining. Some funny anecdotes about the patriarchy and how it exposes itself in day-to-day life. But this is a lot darker than that, and I don't think that you are properly warned going in that this is dealing very much with a history of rape culture and abuse, and you're talking about a lot of historical moments, you're talking about a lot of different actual women who have dealt with horrific, awful things, so it's like, it's a downer of a book. I really didn't appreciate how a lot of beliefs were being framed, particularly how this book discussed Middle Eastern women and their relationship to their religion. Like, it was a lot of shaming, and specifically there was some discussion of veils or hijab, and both were very much through an extremely American lens, and I know this book was written a few years ago, so perhaps this woman's feminism has improved since then, but I didn't really appreciate how we were framing everything as being like, America isn't doing it great, but other countries are doing it worse, because that's Americanized feminism. That's white feminism. I did like a few of the points that were made. A few of the essays were interesting, and I feel like I did learn some stuff about some history, but I also really had a hard time with the narrator of this audiobook that I'm trying very hard not to factor into this review, because the narrator had this way of talking down that really didn't fit the tone of this book. Like, everything she said felt condescending, and she had this weird, cheery, upbeat way of talking about rape and sexual assault that I was like, this is a serious topic. We don't have to still be, like, tongue-in-cheek about this part of the book. So I'm trying not to factor that narration into my review because it really, really hampered my enjoyment of some of the essays that I liked. I wound up giving this, like, a 3 out of 5 star. Like, it definitely had some major points taken off for its lack of being inclusive, and maybe this is more of like a 2 or a 2.5. It did have moments and elements of feminism that weren't so white feminist, that weren't quite as ethnocentric from an American lens, but it was a real mishmash. This was fine. We'll leave it at that. Next up, this is gonna be wild, but I have to talk about Steel Prince Volume 1 by V.E. Schwab, with art by Andrea Olimpieri and coloring by Enrica Aaron Angiolini. So this is a comic series set in the universe of the Shades of Magic, which is my favorite Victoria Schwab, like, collection of work. I love all 3 books to the moon and back again. And this is a prequel series about one of the main characters. His name is Rai. He is the king of my heart and soul. This is about his dad when he is a young and brash prince, and he is out looking for Antari magicians who can open up the walls between worlds, and his father is very much against that and sends him to a far-off colony to learn to be a better soldier and learn to be a better prince. The biggest issue with this book is that the art style is horrendous. Like, I don't want to be quite that over the top about it, but I have to be, because the thing is, you can't tell characters apart when they're fighting, and you can't tell who is using what magic at almost any point. It's just the messiest art style, and it doesn't suit the story, and it doesn't suit the telling of a story because you can't tell what's happening visually. You just have to go based on dialogue, and that should not be the thing that you're doing in a comic series. From like a storytelling perspective, this was really interesting. I really like Maxim, and I really like the new character we were introduced to at the beginning of this book, Isra, who is like a lesbian queen. And I knew I was gonna like her going in because when I talked to Victoria last September, she was the one who was like, by the way, in this comic series, there is a badass lesbian and you're gonna love her. And I was like, sold. And I did love her and I really liked Maxim, but the art style made this almost impossible to get through. It took me a very long time, especially for, you know, Victoria Schwab's books are so visual in terms of how they're described. Like, I can always picture what's happening. She's very good at description, and one of the things I love most about the Shades of Magic series is how beautifully they're described, and that's shown most through, like, A Gathering of Shadows, where the entire time I was reading A Gathering of Shadows, all I wanted was a movie or a show, and I think we're getting that. And so for a series that's so visual, it's really disappointing that the visuals were what was done poorly about this comic series. I don't know if I'm going to continue forward. The only reason I would continue forward with the series is because I really still love Victoria's writing and I like the story that we're getting about Maxim, but I don't know if I would buy a second volume. I might like get it from the library or something because the art is such a slog to get through. So I wound up giving this like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Maybe that review felt more negative than a 3.5. I just think that like if we were basing it on Victoria's writing alone, it would have been a really great series, and any stars removed are purely removed for the art style, which just had a deeply negative effect on the story overall and how it was being told. So, that is Steel Prince. I'm very sad about it. Let's move on. The Air You Breathe by Frances de Pontes Peebles is what I'm going to talk about next. I am so sad that this is the point in this video that I'm talking about this book, because I've been sure for months that this was going to be like a new favorite book of all time for me. It has comparisons to so many of my favorite books ever, and I'm really sad that this is sitting like right in the middle of all the other stuff I read. So The Air You Breathe is a sweeping historical fiction that is set in the 20th century, which is exactly my jam. It is about two people specifically, Graça and Dores, who they first meet in the 1930s in Brazil when Dores is working at a sugar plantation and Graça comes in and she is the new Little Miss. And the two of them connect over music, and it becomes the thing that draws them together, but also the thing that defines their rivalry for one another for their entire lives. This did have a lot of really great elements. I thought it was written quite well, although I had a hard time getting into the style of narration at the beginning. Everything that was set at the sugar plantation, I just had like a real distance from that story, and I kept trying to get into it, but the writing, it felt like it was keeping me at arm's distance, but the longer the book went on, the more I was able to get into it and really appreciate how Dores is telling the story. She's telling the story as like a 90-something-year-old woman looking back on her life, and so there's a distance to it, but that lessens more as the book goes on. I loved the passion for music in this book. I have been reading a lot, so many books recently about musicians. It is really weird, and it was weird to read this almost back to back to Daisy Jones and the Six, because like both of these books are so deeply ingrained in music and passion about music, and specifically songwriting, because Dores is a songwriter and Graça becomes more the performer. But the problem is, I wish I knew how to I almost don't know how to explain my problems with this book without spoiling it, and obviously I'm not going to do that because that's not what a wrap-up is for, but I had a real serious problem going forward with Dores and Graça's relationship, and I don't think my problems were ever suitably wrapped up. Dores is also bisexual, so that becomes like a feature of the book, and it's like increasingly obvious that she is in love with Graça. I think my problem is that Graça never really seems to love anybody but herself, and everyone's aware of this, and yet they do nothing, and yet they all still love her so much. And the way that this book wrapped up, I just felt not that satisfied with the character storylines as they concluded. I don't know, that feels like all I can say without spoiling the book, because my problems are very specifically with the end, how it ended, and how I don't feel it was satisfying for most of the characters involved, but mostly it wasn't satisfying for Dores as a character, and no one was willing to acknowledge that. It just made it kind of a book that I closed the book, and it was beautifully written, and I didn't enjoy it. My ratings are a split between the style and the ability that's put into a book and my personal enjoyment for that book. So despite the fact that I really appreciate the craft that went into this, it's beautifully described, the setting is incredibly realistic. I love the way that we moved through time. I loved how vicious and cutthroat Dores came to be, but I didn't enjoy the process of reading it. and that's a big deal for me when it comes to reading. So I wound up giving this 3.5 out of 5 stars. This has comparisons to so many other queer historical fiction books, and I think that those are earned. I just don't think that this was the book for me. Moving on, we have 4 stars and 1 5-star book, so mostly positive from here on out. Next I have Gmorning, Gnight, Lil Pep Talks, For Me and You by Lin-Manuel Miranda, illustrated by Jonny's son. This is a pretty simple book. I gave it 4 stars because it made me feel good inside, but it's not very deep, so it's not going to stay with me forever, thus it is not a 5-star book. This is basically just a collection of tweets from Lin. He started posting tweets a little while ago, like a year or 2 ago, where every morning he would tweet good morning, and he would say something that maybe he wanted to stay with people throughout the day, and then in the evening he would say goodnight. And he talks a little bit about this in the intro, that the things he was tweeting were the things he needed to hear, and so he just decided he wanted to put those feelings out into the world. And honestly, this is Lin-Manuel Miranda is wonderful, and a lot of his tweets I've loved in the past. This is also full of a lot of really, really great art by Jonny's son. That's honestly one of my favorites, because it's one of my favorite tweets that's included in the collection. But it's just, very simple little stuff. And I read this in little bits and pieces over 5 days of time, and I thought it was really nice. And that's kind of all that needs to be said. 4 stars. It was really sweet. I recommend it. It's fun, even if you want to read a tweet every day, or if you want to read the whole book in one go. It's just uplifting and nice. 4 stars. Next up, we have Miranda in Milan by Katharine Duckett. This is a novella that was just released in March. The sun cannot decide where it wants to exist. Is it sunny? Is it raining? We'll never know. We're gonna turn the camera a little bit in the hopes that my face will catch more sun. This is a reimagining of Shakespeare's The Tempest, but it is more getting into the consequences of The Tempest, which I thought was fascinating. I love Shakespeare. I have been reading and consuming Shakespeare since I was a child because my parents were both theater kids and my mom loves Shakespeare. So I have a deep and abiding love of his works. But specifically, I am always on the hunt for queer Shakespeare because they're queer as fuck and people don't talk about it enough. So this is about Miranda going to Milan after The Tempest ends, and it is a female-female romance, and I loved it. I read The Tempest in college. I thought it was pretty interesting. It's not one of my favorites, but I enjoy it. I thought that this brought so many interesting layers to the story. It was increasingly paranormal. It had a great romance. I loved the romance between these two girls, and I thought it gave Miranda so much more autonomy, and I'm also always after Shakespeare works being reinterpreted to give more autonomy to the women, and this was perfect for that. So if you like Shakespeare, if you don't like Shakespeare, regardless, read this. Like I said, I'd already read The Tempest, but I needed a refresher course. I remembered almost nothing of what happened, and honestly, just rereading the SparkNotes summary, it gave me everything I needed to go into this and really investigate further what, the story was trying to say, imagine all of these different relationships and what would have happened after the conclusion of that play. I really liked this. That is the point. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I am all for all retellings that center women in relationships. It makes me happy. Second to last, we have Drumroll Please by Lisa Jenn Bigelow. This is an arc, but don't be fooled, it was released last year in June, so it's just taken me this long. This is the only middle grade I am talking about in this part of the wrap-up. In April, I was only reading adult and middle grade books, so this was my last middle grade book that I owned. This book is about a little girl named Melly. I believe she's 12, and the day before she leaves with her best friend to go to a band camp, her parents inform her they are getting a divorce. So Melly is thrown into this camp, worrying and feeling like her family is falling apart while she is gone, and she's also starting to feel a distance between her and her best friend, and she's starting to fall for a girl at camp and doesn't know what that means. She doesn't have the language to explain that what she's feeling is a crush. So it's also about this girl, accepting her bisexuality. This was lovely. This was delightful. I highly encourage you to read it and to give it to the young people in your life, because it was a perfect way to talk about the crushes that, like, younger kids have and give them validity, give them language to describe what they're feeling, and to talk about friendship in a spectacularly healthy way with these two girls who are either expecting way too much of the other person or expecting not enough, and how they can communicate and make that better. It's also a really passionate book about music. Yet another book about music. I don't know what's the deal lately. I just read another one last night. I'm just into the music books right now, apparently. But this was a very delightful and sweet book about a girl with a crush and friendship, and a girl using music to finally get her anger into words for her parents, to use music as a way to explain what she's feeling. It's really, really great. Also, it gave me all the camp feels. Like, I've been reading camp books more recently, and I went to camp a lot when I was a kid. I went to Girl Scout camp every year. For a few years, I went to church camp, because that's what you do when you grow up in Utah. And this book is truly the first book that I've read that captured, like, my camp experience, that made me nostalgic for Girl Scout camp. So if you're looking for a camp book, this is the one for you. 4 out of 5 stars. Loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it. And the final book I'm going to talk about in this video is Water Runs Red by Jenna Clare. In case you don't know, Jenna is a booktuber, a lovely, lovely booktuber, who is one of the sweetest people in the world, and I'm very excited that I actually get to meet her at the end of May, finally. Like, we talk online, but it's gonna be so cool to go to BookCon and finally meet, like, all my internet friends. It's gonna be really nice. This book, by the way, was a gift from another lovely booktuber I love. Her channel is Tea Leaves and Bookbindings, and I highly encourage you to check out her channel as well. This is a poetry collection, which is so out of my comfort zone. It's, like, ridiculous. I never read poetry, but I really wanted to read Jenna's book, and I, like, cried through the first part of this, and I was still getting emotional near the end, but truly it was the beginning that got me. This is a poetry collection about a lot of different things. I would say the central theme is, like, friendship breakups and toxic friendships and those concluding. That's what the bulk of this is about, but it is also about finding healthy friendships. It's about finding the people in your life that you can rely on. It is about sort of an uprising and a revolution, and it is about asexuality. And absolutely all of it hit me in a place in my heart, and I cried through it. Yeah. Like, it was a little difficult to get through the beginning bit of, like, the first toxic friendship that Jenna's kind of working through, because even though it was specifically about a toxic friendship and about how friendship breakups are just as difficult as romantic breakups, and I completely agree with that, it was just that reading that beginning bit was exactly how I felt about my romantic relationship ending, and so that was a little difficult to get through. That's why I was crying. It's probably because the girl I was dating was my friend first. She was my best friend, so that relationship was not just about losing a relationship, it was about losing a friend. Complex feels. All the crying. This is a really, really lovely collection. I felt like you could see so much of Jenna in every page. There are so many little bits of Jenna's personality that come through her identity online, on Twitter, and in her videos, and you could see those little elements of her throughout the book, and I think that that made it even more special to me, so I highly recommend this. I am not a poetry person. I do not consume a lot of poetry, so if you are also a person who doesn't consume a lot of poetry, maybe this is an encouraging review for you. If you read a lot of poetry, I don't know what I'm talking about. This was amazing and it made me feel things, and in my experience with poetry, however limited that might be, that is what makes good poetry, is if you feel it and if you understand what the author is trying to work through in that poetry. So I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was absolutely amazing, and I can't wait to meet Jenna, and I'm definitely going to make her sign my book because I loved it a lot. Okay, friends, that is it. Those are all 8 books that I read in the last week of April. What did you think of all of these reviews? Let me know down in the comments below, and let me know if you felt the same way about any of these books, if you have read them as well. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!